Munich and Bonn, 29th of June 2018. Germany's Federal Intelligence Service confirmed that Heinrich Himmler's daughter, Gudrun Burwitz, had quietly worked for the BND in the early 1960s, while she also supported networks that aided former SS men. The disclosure illustrated a stark post-war contrast. While West Germany paid out billions under Wiedergutmachung statutes and endorsed the 1998 Washington Principles on Nazi-looted art, some families of top perpetrators defended legacies, sought restitution of property, or publicly rejected inherited guilt. The same decade saw Nicholas Frank denounce his father, the Butcher of Poland, in books and films. Martin Bormann Jr. become a Catholic priest before later facing abuse claims. Edda Göring litigate over a Cranach. Rolf Mengele meet his fugitive father in Brazil in 1977. Wolf Rüdiger Hess campaign to recast his father's death. And Albert Speer Jr. build a global planning practice while insisting on distance from his father's crimes. The records now show how law, memory and politics shape divergent paths. Bonn and Länder capitals, 1951 to 1956. A finance official in the Federal Ministry reviewed stacked binders. B.W. Goody tables for dismissed public servants. Beg compensation schedules for victims of persecution. Bruges property return files for confiscated assets. The Federal Republic expected rapid closure. The reality proved different. The system became technical, deadline-driven, with exclusions that would require later reforms. Each claim required documentation that Allied bombing and SS record destruction had often erased. Survivors submitted affidavits. Municipal clerks cross-checked deportation lists. Notaries authenticated property transfers made under duress between 1933 and 1945. The architecture took shape in stages. The B.W. Goody addressed former civil servants dismissed on racial or political grounds. The first Beg statute came into force in 1953, expanded in 1956, and formalized by the Beg Schlussgesetz, which established the 31st of December 1969 as the absolute filing deadline. The law stated, nach dem 31. Dezember 1969 können Ansprüche nach dem Bundesentschädigungsgesetz nicht mehr angemeldet werden. That cutoff would later be criticized as arbitrary. The BRU governed the return of confiscated real property and businesses, navigating complex chains of wartime transfers, Aryanizations, and post-war occupancy. Claimants' associations lobbied for broader definitions and longer deadlines. Advisory panels reviewed edge cases. Federal and Länder budgets allocated tens of billions of Deutsche Mark over decades. Yet the statutory channels, robust as they were, delivered financial redress without compelling broader societal reckoning. Moral questions about complicity, inherited guilt, and familial responsibility remained largely the province of civil society, media, and later academic inquiry. By 1998, 44 states endorsed the Washington Principles on Nazi-confiscated art, acknowledging that cultural restitution had remained unresolved since 1945. The principles prioritized identification of looted works, open archives, and just and fair solutions for claimants and current possessors. The contrast was stark. Statutory compensation had procedural finality, while cultural property disputes would remain open-ended, shaped by evolving norms and case-by-case mediation. BND personnel card with alias notation, a Cold War security relic that revealed uncomfortable continuities decades later. Nuremberg to Pullach, 1946 to 1963. A personnel card in the Bundesnachrichtendienst headquarters at Pullach listed an employee under an alias. A margin note read, Sekretärin, 1961 bis 63. The expectation had been that the children of top Nazi leaders would remain in private life, distanced from state institutions rebuilding West Germany's democratic credentials. The reality, disclosed only in June 2018 by BND historian Bodo Hetschelhammer, was that Gudrun Burwitz, daughter of SS Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler, had worked for West Germany's intelligence service in the early 1960s under a false name. The disclosure came amid broader archival releases. Hetschelhammer confirmed that Burwitz's employment had been brief, her role secretarial, and her recruitment part of Cold War pragmatism that prioritized anti-communist intelligence over thorough vetting of family backgrounds. The agency acknowledged that security service continuities had been widespread. Former Wehrmacht intelligence officers, Abwehr operatives, and even individuals with SS connections found roles in the BND, the Federal Criminal Police, and state security agencies. The logic was operational. Experienced personnel, knowledge of Soviet methods, and existing networks outweighed discomfort about the past. Burwitz's parallel activities complicated the picture further. Throughout her adult life, she remained active in Stille Hilfe, Silent Aid, a network that provided legal defense funds, living expenses, and moral support to former SS men facing prosecution or extradition. The organization, founded in the early 1950s by Princess Helene Elisabeth von Eisenberg and other sympathizers, operated openly in Bavaria and Austria. Burwitz attended commemorative events, corresponded with elderly SS veterans, and advocated publicly for their rehabilitation. She never repudiated her father's role or ideology. In interviews, she maintained that he had been misunderstood, that Allied prosecutors had exaggerated crimes, and that SS members deserved recognition for their wartime service. The BND confirmation in 2018 drew international attention. Commentators noted the irony. The same Federal Republic that had compensated hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors and endorsed international restitution norms had once employed the daughter of the man who oversaw the machinery of genocide. The state's legal and financial accountability coexisted with institutional choices that deferred moral reckoning. Even as compensation files closed and archives opened, aid networks for former SS men persisted into the 1990s and beyond. Lucas Cranach the Elder, Madonna and Child, circa 1520, a Renaissance panel whose wartime transfer became a test case for cultural restitution law. Cologne, Karlsruhe and Washington, D.C., 1954 to 1998. A court docket in Cologne cited a Cranach panel, Madonna and Child, transferred in 1938 as a baptismal gift to Edda Göring, daughter of Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring. The expectation had been that high-level gifts from municipal collections would stand as legal transfers. The reality unfolded over 14 years of litigation, ending in January 1968, with a judgment that returned the work to the Wallraf-Richartz Museum. The facts were documented in procurement and baptism records. In November 1938, Mayor Karl Georg Schmidt approved the transfer of the Cranach, valued at 50,000 Reichsmark, from the municipal collection to the Göring family. The transaction was framed as a civic honor. No money changed hands. The city council, dominated by NSDAP appointees, ratified the decision. The panel, depicting the Virgin and Infant Christ, was delivered to the Göring estate at Karinhall, north of Berlin. After the war, Edda Göring claimed ownership. The city of Cologne, supported by museum director Gert von der Osten and Advocate General Philipp Auerbach, filed suit to recover the work, arguing that the transfer had constituted a breach of fiduciary duty and an unlawful alienation of public property under municipal statutes predating Nazi rule. The first instance court in Cologne ruled for the city in the early 1950s, but an appellate panel in 1954 reversed, finding that the transaction had been formally valid under the law in force at the time. The city appealed to the Bundesgerichtshof. In 1962, the BGH issued a landmark opinion. It held that municipal officials owed a duty to preserve public collections, that wartime pressures and political loyalty had vitiated the council's consent, and that post-war restitution principles required courts to look beyond formal legality to the substance of wartime transactions. The case was remanded. On the 23rd of January 1968, the Oberlandesgericht Cologne entered a final judgment in favour of the city. The Cranach returned to the Wallraf-Richartz Museum where it remains. The litigation anticipated the 1998 Washington Conference on Holocaust-era assets. 44 governments, meeting in the US Capitol, endorsed 11 principles on Nazi-confiscated art. The principles were non-binding, but established international norms: identify looted works, open archives and records, facilitate research and publication, and seek just and fair solutions that acknowledge victims' losses and current possessors' good faith. The Cranach case had shown that German courts, even in the 1960s, were willing to unwind wartime transfers when evidence demonstrated coercion or abuse of public trust. The Washington Principles globalized that approach, extending it beyond state-held property to private collections, insurance claims, and Judaica. Courts could resolve specific disputes over paintings, but broader questions about family reputations, inherited responsibility, and the politics of memory remained contested in the press, in documentaries, and at commemorative events. Stille, Hilfe donor roster, a Cold War-era ledger documenting financial and moral support for former SS men. Bavaria and Austria, 1951 to 2018. A Stille Hilfe donor list circulated among sympathizers in Munich and Salzburg. The organization, founded by Princess Helene Elisabeth von Isenburg, provided legal defense funds, living stipends, and advocacy for former Waffen-SS and SS members facing prosecution, extradition, or social ostracism. Travel notes recorded attendance at memorial gatherings where aging veterans wore their decorations and sang old songs. The expectation among Allied officials and German Democrats had been that families of top perpetrators would withdraw quietly into private life. The reality was that Gudrun Burwitz, daughter of Heinrich Himmler, became Stille Hilfe's most visible advocate, maintaining public loyalty to her father's memory and the men who served under him. Burwitz never repudiated Himmler's ideology. In interviews over 5 decades, she insisted he had been misunderstood, that Allied accounts of the Holocaust were exaggerated, and that SS members had been loyal soldiers unfairly demonized by victors' justice. She attended funerals of convicted war criminals, corresponded with prisoners in Germany and abroad, and lobbied for early releases and pardons. Stille Hilfe provided funds for attorneys who challenged extradition requests, appealed convictions, or sought retrials on procedural grounds. The network aided Anton Maloth, an SS guard convicted in Italy of murdering prisoners, helping him evade capture for years. It supported former camp personnel, Einsatzgruppen members, and men convicted at Nuremberg or in subsequent national trials. The BND employment, confirmed in June 2018, added another dimension. While Burwitz worked for West Germany's intelligence service in the early 1960s, albeit briefly and under an alias, she simultaneously maintained ties to Stille Hilfe and its networks. The juxtaposition illustrated the contradictions of Cold War West Germany, a state that compensated victims, prosecuted perpetrators, and built democratic institutions, yet also recruited former Nazis for intelligence work and tolerated advocacy networks that defended SS legacies. Security agencies prioritized anti-communist operations over thorough denazification. Burwitz's dual role, BND secretary and SS advocate, became public only after her death in May 2018 and the agency's subsequent disclosure. Obituaries noted her unrepentant stance. The BBC, the Times of Israel, and German outlets described a woman who spent 70 years defending her father and his subordinates. Historians observed that private networks like Stille Hilfe had influenced legal defense strategies, shaped public narratives among sympathizers, and prolonged battles over memory and accountability. The same state that dispersed billions under beggy compensation statutes had once employed the daughter of the SS Reichsführer. The files documented the fact. The moral contradiction remained unresolved. Austrian Church Redress Commission files, bureaucratic records of institutional abuse, compensation, and scandal. Austria and Germany, 1959 to 2011. Parish bulletins in Austrian villages announced the arrival of a new priest. His surname was Bormann. The expectation was that ordination would draw a line between Martin Bormann Jr. and the legacy of his father, Martin Bormann, Hitler's powerful private secretary. The reality proved more complex. Bormann Jr. entered the priesthood in 1959, served in parishes and later as a missionary in the Congo, and cultivated a public image of personal redemption and distance from Nazism. Decades later, in 2011, Austrian media reported allegations of sexual abuse and confirmed that church-linked redress bodies, including the Cranach Commission, had processed compensation claims related to his ministry. The reports were careful. They noted that Bormann Jr. had been laicized in 1971, that allegations emerged long after his departure from active ministry, and that Austrian church commissions had adjudicated claims according to confidential procedures. The commissions, established in the wake of broader institutional abuse scandals, reviewed cases, determined credibility, and awarded financial settlements without requiring public trials or criminal convictions. Payments were made, names and details were often withheld to protect claimants' privacy. Bormann Jr.'s case became public because of his surname and the resulting media scrutiny. Obituaries in 2013 described a man who had spent decades trying to distance himself from his father's crimes. He gave interviews emphasizing his Catholic vocation and rejection of Nazism. He worked in disadvantaged communities. Yet the 2011 revelations complicated that narrative. Institutional abuse cases rarely offered clear moral conclusions. Allegations were serious, defenses were limited, and redress commissions operated outside traditional judicial standards. Bormann Jr.'s case illustrated how personal reinvention could collide with later institutional reckoning, leaving public opinion uncertain. The broader context mattered. Austria's church redress mechanisms emerged in response to widespread abuse scandals in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The Cranach Commission and successor bodies processed thousands of claims, paying tens of millions of euros in settlements. The process was administrative, not judicial, prioritizing claimants' privacy and avoiding protracted litigation. In Bormann Jr.'s case, the surname guaranteed attention. The Independent and other outlets covered the story, noting the historical irony. Bearing a notorious name did not dictate either repentance or credibility. Reinvention through ministry had not insulated him from scandal, and the public was left to reconcile competing narratives: personal vocation versus institutional failure, distancing from Nazism versus later allegations. Niklas Frank's book, Der Vater, eine Abrechnung, The Father, A Reckoning, 1987, a scathing public indictment that became a reference point in debates over inherited guilt. Munich, Warsaw, and London, 1987 to 2015. A newsroom copy of Der Vater, eine Abrechnung, sat on a table at Stern magazine's Munich headquarters. The author, Niklas Frank, was the son of Hans Frank, Nazi Governor-General of occupied Poland, hanged at Nuremberg in October 1946. The expectation among many Germans had been that children of executed leaders would remain silent, balancing private shame with public discretion. The reality was different. Niklas Frank published a book-length denunciation of his father, calling him a mass murderer who deserved to hang, and spent the next 3 decades repeating that judgment in interviews, documentaries, and public debates. The book's tone was harsh. Frank described his father's crimes in detail: the deportation and murder of Polish Jews, the suppression of resistance, the looting of art and property, the administration of ghettos and labor camps. He quoted from Hans Frank's diaries, introduced as evidence at Nuremberg, which documented orders, meetings, and policies. Niklas Frank did not soften the portrait. He wrote that his father had been a coward, a careerist, and a willing participant in genocide. He rejected the defense that Hans Frank had converted to Catholicism before execution or expressed remorse. Niklas Frank's verdict was unambiguous. His father had been guilty, the Nuremberg judgment had been just, and no amount of time or filial loyalty could change that. The book attracted attention in Germany and abroad. It became a touchstone in debates over Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past. Some praised Frank's candor and moral clarity. Others found the tone too harsh, the judgments too absolute. Frank appeared in documentaries, including the 2015 film My Nazi Legacy, directed by Philippe Sands, which contrasted his condemnation of Hans Frank with the more ambivalent stance of Horst von Wächter, son of Otto von Wächter, another governor-general implicated in atrocities. The contrast was stark. Niklas Frank called his father a criminal. Horst von Wächter defended his father's memory, citing lack of direct evidence. Interviews and Holocaust Museum archives recorded Frank's statements. He told Time and other outlets that children of Nazi leaders had a responsibility to acknowledge their father's crimes publicly, that silence was complicity, and that inherited guilt was not about legal liability but moral witness. His stance was controversial. Some children of perpetrators agreed. Others found the demand for public repudiation intrusive and unfair. In the arena of memory, Nicholas Frank chose the role of prosecutor. His testimony became part of the historical record. Baptism ledger and procurement file for Lucas Cranach, the elder's Madonna and child, documents that anchored 14 years of restitution litigation. Karen Hall, Cologne and Karlsruhe, 1938 to 1968. A baptism ledger from November 1938 listed gifts presented to Edda Göring, infant daughter of Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring. Among them, a Renaissance panel by Lucas Cranach the Elder, transferred from the city of Cologne's Wallraf-Richartz Museum. A municipal procurement file documented the transaction. 50,000 Reichsmark valuation, Mayor Karl Georg Schmidt's approval, City Council ratification. The expectation had been that the gift would remain in the Göring family's possession. The reality unfolded through multi-stage litigation that ended in January 1968 with the paintings returned to the museum. The sequence was documented in court records. After the war, the city of Cologne, supported by museum officials and Advocate General Philipp Auerbach, filed suit to recover the Cranach. The claim rested on municipal law. Officials owed a fiduciary duty to preserve public collections, and wartime political pressures had vitiated the council's consent. The first instance court ruled for the city. Edda Göring appealed. In 1954, an appellate panel reversed, holding that the transaction had been formally valid under the law in force at the time. The city appealed to the Bundesgerichtshof. In 1962, the BGH issued a landmark opinion. It held that courts must look beyond formalities to the substance of wartime transactions, that public officials' duties survived changes in regime, and that restitution principles required courts to remedy transfers made under coercion or abuse of trust. The case was remanded for further proceedings. Additional evidence was presented: testimony from museum staff who had opposed the transfer, documentation of Nazi pressure on city officials, records showing that no equivalent gift had ever been made from public collections under democratic governance. On the 23rd of January, 1968, the Oberlandesgericht Cologne entered a final judgment in favour of the city. The Cranach panel was returned to the Wallraf-Richartz Museum, where it remains in the permanent collection. The litigation anticipated the 1998 Washington Conference on Holocaust-era assets. The 11 Washington Principles, endorsed by 44 governments, called for identification of Nazi-looted art, open archives, and just and fair solutions for claimants and possessors. The Cranach case had shown that German courts, even decades earlier, were willing to unwind wartime transfers when evidence demonstrated coercion or institutional failure. The principles globalized that approach, applying it to private collections, Judaica, and insurance claims. Yet while courts could adjudicate ownership of canvases, they could not resolve the politics of provenance. Family reputations remained contested in memoirs, documentaries, and public debates. DOJ Office of Special Investigations intake log for Joseph Mengelé's papers, 5,000 pages of diaries, letters, and writings that anchored post-mortem research. São Paulo and Washington, D.C., 1977 to 1992. A modest bungalow near Diadema, a working-class suburb of São Paulo. In February 1977, Rolf Mengele, a 33-year-old German lawyer, travelled to Brazil to meet his father, Josef Mengele. The Auschwitz doctor wanted for war crimes. The expectation, held by Rolf and some international observers, was that the meeting might produce contrition, an acknowledgement of guilt, or at least a private reckoning. The reality, documented in later interviews and OSI reports, was different. Josef Mengele remained unrepentant, insisting he had harmed no one, that his experiments had been medically justified, and that Allied prosecutors had fabricated charges. Rolf later described the encounter to journalists. He said he had challenged his father directly, citing survivor testimony and documentary evidence. Josef Mengele dismissed the accounts as lies. He claimed Jewish witnesses had exaggerated or invented stories. He maintained that camp doctors had worked under impossible conditions, that epidemic disease had caused most deaths, and that his research had been legitimate. Rolf, shaken by his father's denials, returned to Germany and largely withdrew from public life. He gave occasional interviews but refused to become an advocate, either for or against his father's memory. Joseph Mengele drowned while swimming off a Brazilian beach in February 1979. Brazilian and German authorities confirmed the identity through forensic examination in 1985. The same year, Rolf Mengele transferred 5,000 pages of his father's papers, diaries, letters, notebooks, sketches, to US and German investigators. The documents entered the archives of the US Department of Justice's Office of Special Investigations. In 1992, OSI published a detailed report in the matter of Joseph Mengele, which synthesized witness testimony, archival records, and Mengele's own writings. The report confirmed that Mengele had overseen selections on the Auschwitz ramp, conducted experiments on twins and other prisoners, and ordered or performed killings. The 1977 meeting and subsequent archival transfer became central to modern Mengele research. Historians gained access to the fugitive's own accounts, even as those accounts revealed self-justification and denial. Rolf Mengele's role was documented but limited. He confronted his father, received no satisfaction, and then provided the papers to authorities. The most infamous Nazi fugitive's legacy reached courtrooms and research labs only after his death. The files anchored prosecutions, scholarship, and public memory. The meeting showed that personal confrontation could not compel accountability. Only the accumulated weight of evidence, law, and historical judgment could do that. British Royal Military Police, SIB investigation file on Rudolf Hess's death, official documentation that concluded suicide despite persistent family counter-narratives. Spandau Prison, Berlin and London, 1987 to 2013. A Royal Military Police file in the Special Investigation Branch headquarters documented the death of Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, in Spandau Prison on the 17th of August 1987. Hess, 93 years old and the prison's sole remaining inmate, was found hanging in a garden shed. British, American, French and Soviet authorities launched a joint inquiry. The expectation among Allied officials was that the investigation would confirm suicide and close the case. The reality was more complicated. The four-power inquiry concluded suicide, but Hess's son, Wolf Rudiger Hess, commissioned independent autopsies, published counter-narratives, and sustained conspiracy theories for the next 14 years. The official findings were documented in SIB reports, later released to the UK National Archives. Investigators found no evidence of foul play. Hess had left a note. Prison logs showed no unauthorized entries. Medical evidence was consistent with self-inflicted hanging. A four-power statement affirmed these conclusions. In October 1987, a UK government spokesman confirmed to Parliament that the Allies were satisfied Hess had taken his own life. The statement appeared in Hansard and was later cited by the UK Ministry of Defence when it released. Redacted SIB files in 2013. Wolf Rudiger Hess rejected the official account. He hired forensic pathologists who issued reports questioning the physical evidence. He published pamphlets alleging murder by British intelligence. He organised commemorative marches in Wunsiedel, Bavaria, where Rudolf Hess was buried, attracting neo-Nazis and sympathisers. German authorities later banned the marches and relocated Hess's remains to prevent the grave from becoming a pilgrimage site. Wolf Rudiger Hess continued his campaign until his death in 2001. His arguments circulated in far-right circles, on websites, and in self-published books. The official record remained unchanged. UK archival releases in 2013 included SIB documents, four-power correspondence, and medical reports. All supported the suicide conclusion. Lieutenant-Colonel Tony Letizier, a British officer who served at Spandau, published a memoir corroborating the official account. Academic historians, including those who wrote critical biographies of Rudolf Hess, found no credible evidence of murder. The case illustrated a recurring pattern. Where official findings were clear, family-driven counter-narratives persisted, fueled by distrust of Allied authorities and ideological commitment to rehabilitation. Files closed the case in law and history. Public suspicion among certain audiences did not. AS&P master planning drawings, documents that marked a career continually measured against a father's crimes and myth-making. Frankfurt, Doha, and Beijing, 1977 to 2017. A master planning sheet bore the stamp of AS&P, Albert Speer and Partner, the architecture and urban planning firm founded by Albert Speer Jr., son of Hitler's chief architect and armaments minister. The younger Speer built a global practice, designing projects for Expo 2000 in Hanover, the Beijing Olympics in 2008, and Qatar's FIFA World Cup infrastructure in 2022. The expectation among some clients and observers was that professional success and explicit public distancing would sever the connection to his father's legacy. The reality was that Albert Speer Jr.'s career remained continually scrutinized, his statements passed, and his projects debated in terms of inherited reputation. Speer Jr. addressed the issue directly in interviews. The Washington Post quoted him in a 2017 obituary. "I have spent my entire life trying to differentiate myself." He emphasized that he had chosen urban planning, not monumental architecture, and that his work prioritized livability, sustainability, and public space. He rejected his father's grandiose totalitarian aesthetic, yet journalists and historians noted ambiguities. Some AS&P projects featured large-scale state-sponsored designs for authoritarian or semi-authoritarian clients. Critics questioned whether the younger Speer had truly escaped his father's shadow, or simply adapted the same impulses, service to power, large-scale planning, state patronage, to new contexts. Albert Speer Sr. had cultivated a post-war myth. The good Nazi, the technocrat who claimed ignorance of the Holocaust, expressed remorse at Nuremberg and served 20 years in Spandau. Historians later dismantled the myth, showing that Speer had known about forced labor, that his armaments ministry had relied on concentration camp workers, and that his memoirs had been carefully constructed to minimize guilt. Gitta Sereni, Adam Tooze, and others documented the deceptions. Albert Speer Jr. acknowledged these findings publicly, stating that his father had lied and that the myth was untenable. Yet the surname carried weight. Each new AS&P project prompted commentary. Profiles in The Guardian, Der Spiegel, and other outlets reviewed the family history. Architectural critics debated whether the son's work replicated authoritarian aesthetics or genuinely broke from them. Speer Jr.'s career prospered. His firm completed major commissions on 5 continents, but lineage was never fully severed. Professional reinvention coexisted with inescapable scrutiny. The files showed accomplishment and controversy in equal measure. Washington Conference on Holocaust-era Assets folder, November-December 1998, the international framework that reframed family disputes as structured legal ethical cases. Washington, D.C., Berlin, and The Hague, 1998 to 2024. A conference folder from the Washington Conference on Holocaust-era Assets, held in late 1998, contained the text of 11 principles on Nazi-confiscated art. 44 governments endorsed the principles, which called for identification of looted works, open archives, publication of findings, and pursuit of just and fair solutions for claimants and possessors. The expectation among some officials had been that 6 decades after the war, remaining restitution issues could be resolved quickly. The reality proved different. The principles launched decades of slow, case-by-case mediation, evolving best practices, national implementing legislation, and periodic reforms of advisory bodies. The principles were non-binding. They established norms, not obligations. Governments agreed to facilitate research, lower archival barriers, and encourage fair settlements. They acknowledged that wartime duress, post-war chaos, and good faith purchases by later owners created complex equities. The goal was not to impose uniform rules, but to provide a framework for balancing competing claims. Stuart E. Eisenstadt, U.S. Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs, led the American delegation. His remarks, preserved in State Department archives, emphasized moral responsibility, transparency, and the need for ongoing vigilance. National implementations varied. Germany established an advisory commission on the return of cultural property seized as a result of Nazi persecution, known informally as the Limbach Commission after its first chair, Jutta Limbach. The commission mediated disputes, issued non-binding recommendations, and published case summaries. Austria, the Netherlands, France, and other countries created similar bodies. The United States encouraged museums and collectors to conduct provenance research and adopted the American Alliance of Museums Guidelines, which incorporated the Washington Principles. In 2024, U.S. officials mark the principles' 25th anniversary with renewed commitments to transparency and best practices. The process remained contentious. Heirs of victims pressed claims against museums, dealers, and private collectors. Possessors argued they had acquired works in good faith, that decades had passed, and that legal title had been perfected under applicable statutes of limitations. Advisory commissions reviewed evidence, wartime sales records, export licenses, affidavits, and provenance gaps. Many cases resulted in negotiated settlements, shared ownership, financial compensation, or long-term loans. Some remained unresolved. The Washington Principles had reframed legacy battles from family disputes into structured legal ethical processes. International norms bent the arc toward transparency. Unanimity was never the goal. The standard, once set, remained fixed, even as cases multiplied. Comparative table of family responses, a synthesis document showing divergent strategies across decades. Germany and diaspora, 1946 to 2018. A comparative table compiled by historians documented the divergent post-war strategies of Nazi leaders' children, denial and defense, public repudiation, and professional reinvention shadowed by scandal. The table listed names, key events, court outcomes, public statements, and archival deposits. It showed patterns that legal and financial resolutions could not erase. Denial and defense. Gudrun Burwitz spent 70 years defending her father's memory through Stille Hilfe, attending commemorations for former SS men, and publicly rejecting the historical consensus on Nazi crimes. The BND's June 2018 acknowledgement that she had worked for West German intelligence in the early 1960s while simultaneously aiding ex-SS networks illustrated the contradictions of Cold War reconstruction. State compensation and intelligence pragmatism coexisted with private advocacy that sustained counter-narratives. Repudiation. Niklas Frank published Der Vater, eine Abrechnung in 1987, calling his father a mass murderer and declaring that the Nuremberg verdict had been just. He repeated the judgment in interviews with Time, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, and Holocaust museums. He participated in the 2015 documentary My Nazi Legacy, where his condemnation contrasted with the more ambivalent stance of Horst von Wächter. Frank's public testimony became a reference point in debates over inherited guilt and moral witness. Reinvention with shadows. Martin Bormann Jr. entered the priesthood in 1959, served in parishes and missions, and cultivated an image of redemption. In 2011, Austrian media reported abuse allegations and confirmed compensation payments through church redress bodies. Albert Speer Jr. built AS&P into a global planning firm, designed projects for Beijing 2008 and Qatar 2022, and publicly stated he had spent his life differentiating himself from his father, yet remained subject to continual scrutiny about inherited aesthetics and authoritarian clients. Documented judicial outcomes. The Cranach panel returned to Cologne in January 1968 after 14 years of litigation. The Federal Court of Justice held that municipal officials' fiduciary duties survived regime changes and that wartime political pressure vitiated consent. Edda Göring's claim failed. The case anticipated the Washington Principles, which codified similar reasoning for cultural restitution globally. Archival releases. The U.S. Department of Justice's Office of Special Investigations published In the Matter of Joseph Mengele in 1992, synthesizing 5,000 pages of documents Rolf Mengele had transferred in 1985. British SIB files on Rudolf Hess's death, released to the UK National Archives in 2013, reaffirmed the 1987 four-power conclusion of suicide. Wolf Rüdiger Hess's counter-campaign persisted until his death in 2001, but official findings never changed. The synthesis showed that where courts and archives were clear, ownership of paintings, cause of death, documentary evidence of crimes, legal and historical judgments stood. Yet societal judgments diverged. Families defended, repudiated, or reinvented. Memory battles continued in books, films, and commemorations. Legal clarity did not end the contest over reputation and responsibility. Archive Reading Room Request Log, a record of ongoing inquiry into files that continue to grow even as standards remain fixed. Berlin, Washington, and The Hague, 1992 to 2025. A reading room log at the German Federal Archives recorded requests for Spandau prison SIB files, Mengele diaries from the OSI collection, and restitution case dockets from advisory commission proceedings. Researchers, journalists, and family members continued to access materials decades after the events. The requests reflected ongoing interest in questions that statutory deadlines, court judgments, and official reports had formally closed, but public discourse had not. Legal consequences. The Washington Principles, endorsed in 1998, established structures that moved some contested property to heirs or public institutions. Germany's Advisory Commission issued non-binding recommendations in dozens of cases. Austria, the Netherlands, and France created similar bodies. Outcomes varied: negotiated sales, long-term loans, shared ownership, or retention by possessors who had acquired works in good faith. Many claims remained unresolved. The international framework prioritized transparency and mediation over uniform rules. The US State Department's 2024 remarks on the Principles' 25th anniversary reaffirmed the commitment to just and fair solutions without prescribing specific outcomes. Financial consequences. Germany's compensation architecture, BW Good, Beg, Brugg, and successor programs, disbursed tens of billions of euros to victims and heirs over 7 decades. The Beg Schlussgesetz formalized the 31st of December 1969 filing deadline, later criticized as arbitrary. Subsequent reforms addressed gaps: hardship fund payments for survivors excluded from Beg, pension supplements for aging claimants, and compensation for forced laborers through the 2000 Remembrance Responsibility and the Future Foundation. Canadian diplomatic briefings and German Finance Ministry timelines documented the scale. By 2000, Germany had paid over 100 billion Deutsche Mark in restitution and compensation since 1952. Cultural consequences. Documentaries, oral histories, and interviews standardized a vocabulary of inherited guilt and responsibility in public discourse. Nicholas Frank's testimony appeared in Holocaust Museum archives. The 2015 film My Nazi Legacy, featuring Frank and Horst von Wechter, screened at festivals and museums. PBS and BBC produced features on children of perpetrators. The British Film Institute catalogued holdings on post-war memory politics. Burwitz's BND employment became international news in 2018. Speer Jr.'s obituaries reviewed a career measured by his surname. The cultural record preserved contradictions, legal accountability and private denial, public repudiation and quiet reinvention, official closure and ongoing debate. Final archival marker. In 1998, 44 governments endorsed principles prioritizing identification of Nazi-looted art, open archives, and just and fair solutions for victims' heirs and current possessors. The State Department published the full text. National implementations followed. Advisory commissions adjudicated cases. Museums updated provenance databases. The files kept growing. The standard remained fixed: transparency, research, and case-by-case fairness. Legal and archival clarity coexisted with persistent memory contests. The documentary record showed not resolution but process, structured, transparent, ongoing. History closed some chapters. The reading room logs showed others still being written.